Welcome to Beyond the Tomb, the podcast where faith meets reason and ancient truths speak to our modern questions. Together, we'll explore the claims of Jesus, the evidence for the resurrection, and the reliability of the scriptures. Here, we don't just examine history, we uncover the story that continues to shape lives today. So join us as we journey beyond the tomb into the hope, the mystery, and the truth of the gospel.
Here's something that might surprise you. In first century Judaism, claiming to be God was considered such a serious offense that it was punishable by death. Yet there was one historical figure who repeatedly made this exact claim, and the evidence is fascinating.
That's really interesting timing because I was just reading about how many people tried to paint Jesus as just a wise teacher, but the historical record shows something far more dramatic.
Let's look at that story from Mark 2. Jesus encounters a paralyzed man, and instead of just healing him, he does something completely shocking. He forgives the man's sins. In Jewish culture, this was essentially claiming God's authority.
Well, that must have caused quite a stir. Only God could forgive sins in their worldview. It would be like someone today claiming they could rewrite the laws of physics.
And here's what makes it even more fascinating. When challenged, Jesus doesn't back down. Instead, he proves his authority by healing the man right there. It's like saying, "And if you don't believe I can forgive sins, watch this."
You know what really catches my attention? The way he used cultural references his audience would instantly recognize, like calling himself the Good Shepherd.
That's such a crucial point. When he made that statement, he was deliberately echoing Ezekiel 34, where God himself is described as Israel's shepherd. His audience would have immediately understood the implication.
That reminds me of that encounter with the Samaritan woman. The way he demonstrates supernatural knowledge of her life and then just directly confirms he's the Messiah. Pretty bold stuff.
And then there's what might be the most dramatic claim of all, those I am statements. When Jesus said, "Before Abraham was, I am," he was literally using God's divine name from Exodus 3. The reaction was so intense that the crowd picked up stones to execute him.
So what happened during his actual trial? How did he handle these claims when his life was literally on the line?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting. When the high priest asks him directly if he's the Son of God, Jesus doesn't try to save himself. Instead, he quotes Daniel's prophecy about the divine Messiah, basically doubling down on his claims.
And these weren't just empty claims either. He consistently demonstrated supernatural power to back them up, right?
Exactly, like that scene in the Garden of Gethsemane where he uses the divine name I am, and the soldiers literally fall to the ground. But you know what's fascinating? These weren't just theological statements. They had practical implications.
What do you mean by practical implications?
Well, take that promise in John 10 about his followers never perishing and no one being able to snatch them from his hand. He's essentially saying, because I am who I am, I can guarantee your eternal security. That's a pretty remarkable claim.
That reminds me of what C.S. Lewis said about Jesus being either a lunatic, a liar, or exactly who he claimed to be. There's really no middle ground.
Right, and that's why these claims are still so challenging today. They force us to make a decision. We can't just admire Jesus from a comfortable distance as a wise teacher. His claims demand a response.
And what's particularly interesting is how consistent these claims are across different contexts and different authors.
You know what else stands out? The way he often connected these claims to actual demonstrations of power. Like when he tells Martha, "I am the resurrection and the life," and then proceeds to raise her brother from the dead. He wasn't just making statements, he was backing them up.
That's such a powerful observation about how his identity claims connected directly to his actions.
And that's really the bottom line here. These weren't just bold statements floating in isolation. They were backed up by actions that demonstrated his authority. Whether it was healing the sick, controlling nature, or raising the dead, his actions aligned perfectly with his claims about his identity.
His claims weren't just bold statements. They were backed up by actions.
Right. And the ultimate action was the resurrection. If Jesus really rose from the dead, that validates every claim he ever made. Want to dive into that?
Are you kidding me? Of course I do.
Here's something that might surprise you. In a time when women's testimony wasn't even accepted in court, the most important event in Christian history, the resurrection of Jesus, was first witnessed by a group of women. That fact alone makes this historical investigation fascinating.
That's such an interesting point about historical credibility. We're looking at evidence that actually becomes more compelling because it goes against what you'd expect from that time period.
And speaking of unexpected elements, let's talk about the numbers involved. We're not just dealing with a handful of witnesses. Historical records mention over 500 people who claim to have seen Jesus after his death. That's like having every person in a small town as an eyewitness.
Well, that's what makes this such an interesting historical case. These weren't private visions or isolated incidents. We're talking about multiple group encounters that could be verified by contemporary sources.
You know what's particularly striking? The empty tomb itself. In a politically charged environment, where both religious and Roman authorities had every reason to want to disprove these claims, nobody ever produced a body.
That's actually a crucial detail I hadn't considered. The authorities could have immediately shut down this movement by simply showing Jesus' body, but they didn't, or couldn't.
And let's talk about the psychological transformation we see in the historical record. These disciples went from hiding in fear to boldly proclaiming their message in the very city where Jesus was executed. That's a pretty dramatic shift in behavior.
The psychological aspect is fascinating. What could make a group of people suddenly willing to face torture and death for something they were previously too afraid to even talk about?
Well, here's another layer to consider. These weren't sophisticated philosophers or trained speakers. Many were fishermen and tax collectors, yet they suddenly became articulate defenders of a message that spread rapidly across the Roman Empire.
That rapid spread across different cultures and social classes is pretty remarkable for that time period, especially given the limitations in communication and travel.
And let's not overlook the skeptics in this story. Take Thomas, for example. He basically demanded forensic evidence, saying he wouldn't believe unless he could physically examine Jesus' wounds. That's not the attitude of someone who's easily convinced.
So what you're saying is that even the early accounts show critical thinking and doubt among the witnesses, which actually adds to their credibility?
Exactly, and these accounts were being circulated while the events were still fresh. We have early creedal statements that can be dated to within a few years of the events they describe, which is remarkably early for ancient historical documentation.
The timing of these accounts really does matter from a historical perspective. These weren't legends that developed over centuries. They were contemporary accounts that could be verified or disputed by living witnesses.
And here's something else to consider. These claims weren't being made in some distant land. They were being made right in Jerusalem, where anyone could investigate the empty tomb, talk to the witnesses, and verify the claims.
That geographical context is crucial. It's like making a major historical claim today in New York City, where millions of people could fact-check your story.
You know what's particularly interesting? The way these events connect to earlier prophecies. We're not just looking at isolated incidents, we're seeing the culmination of predictions and expectations that had been documented for centuries.
The interconnected nature of all these pieces of evidence does make this a unique historical case study, doesn't it?
And perhaps that's why this topic continues to generate such intense discussion. Whether someone accepts the resurrection or not, the historical evidence presents some fascinating questions that deserve serious consideration.
That's really what makes this such an enduring historical mystery. The evidence is substantial enough to demand attention, yet the implications are so profound that they can't be approached casually.
Looking at it from a purely historical perspective, we're dealing with a combination of elements that's hard to explain away. Multiple witnesses, early documentation, dramatic psychological transformations, and a movement that not only survived intense opposition, but thrived under it.
Jesus consistently demonstrated authority through his works.
And that's why the Gospels recording these works are so important. How do we know we can actually trust what they wrote? Let's talk about the reliability of Scripture.
Yes, this is one of my favorite topics.
The reliability of ancient texts seems pretty straightforward until you discover that we have more manuscript copies of the Bible than we do of Julius Caesar's writings. And the gap isn't even close.
That's a fascinating comparison. What exactly are we talking about in terms of numbers?
Well, for Caesar's writings, historians have found just 251 copies, with the earliest coming nearly 1,000 years after he wrote them. But for the New Testament alone, we have over 5,000 manuscripts, some dating back to within 100 years of the original writings.
That's quite a difference. But how do we know these copies are accurate to the originals?
That's where it gets really interesting. Through statistical analysis, we can actually measure our confidence in the original text. With Homer's works, which have about 1,800 manuscripts, we're 95% confident in the original content. But the Bible's larger number of earlier manuscripts gives us over 99% confidence.
So what you're saying is that we actually have more evidence for the Bible's accuracy than many other historical documents we take for granted.
Exactly right. And here's where it gets even more fascinating. Archaeological discoveries keep confirming details that skeptics once questioned. Like in the 1920s, they found these ancient cities that matched biblical descriptions perfectly. Places like Ur, which some people claimed couldn't have existed that early.
Oh wow. So the physical evidence is actually backing up the written accounts?
Yeah. And it's not just cities. They've found these incredible engravings in Egyptian tombs showing ceremonies that match biblical descriptions exactly. There are even ancient Babylonian records describing a worldwide flood and a confusion of languages, stories that parallel biblical accounts.
That's pretty remarkable, but surely there must still be parts that can't be verified?
Well, of course, just like with any historical document. But here's the key thing. Wherever we can check the Bible's accuracy, it consistently holds up. They've even found clay tablets from 2300 BC in Syria that support Old Testament stories, vocabulary, and geography.
You mentioned something earlier about the Hittites. What was that about?
Oh, right. That's actually one of the most interesting examples. For years, skeptics doubted the Hittites even existed, despite being mentioned multiple times in the Bible. Then archaeologists discovered an entire Hittite city in Turkey, complete with their historical records.
That must have been quite a moment for biblical archaeology.
It really was, and it's just one of many similar discoveries. Luke, who wrote one of the Gospels in Acts, has been praised by modern historians for his incredible attention to detail and accurate reporting. They keep finding evidence that confirms the names of cities, political officials, and events he described.
This whole discussion really changes how we might think about ancient texts and their verification.
That's exactly right. And what's particularly fascinating is how this combines multiple lines of evidence: archaeological findings, manuscript analysis, historical records, and cultural parallels. It's like putting together a massive historical puzzle where the pieces keep fitting together.
And it sounds like new discoveries are still being made.
Absolutely right. Every new archaeological dig has the potential to uncover more evidence. And so far, the trend has been remarkably consistent in supporting these ancient accounts. It really challenges us to reconsider how we verify historical reliability.
This was a really amazing conversation today. We covered so much.
Well, that's a lot to chew on. From Jesus claiming to be more than just a teacher, to the eyewitnesses who swore they saw him alive, to the reliability of the scriptures that carried those claims through the centuries. It really paints a picture that's hard to ignore.
Exactly. Whether someone is wrestling with doubts or just curious, the evidence points us back to the same question Jesus asked his disciples: "Who do you say I am?" That's a question every one of us has to answer for ourselves.
And that's why we love doing this, because we're not just talking about history or ideas, we're talking about truth that still changes lives today.
Well, that wraps up today's episode. Thanks for joining us on Beyond the Tomb. If this sparked questions for you, or if you want to dig deeper, check out the scriptures for yourself. Don't just take our word for it.
Absolutely. And if you enjoyed this conversation, make sure to follow the show, share it with a friend, and stay tuned.
Until then, keep seeking truth, and we'll see you next time.